You can see anything that you imagine right now. There's no place that your awareness can't take you. There's no condition of body or mind your awareness can't register, even in this very instant. If you think of, I just thought, for example, of anxiety and my stomach got tight. It's just instantaneous. Your awareness and awareness of ignorance is freedom from ignorance. So, what Gail was bringing up, the litany of obstructions to love that she was enumerating for us, kindly, I say, very kindly, because I'm sure it registered with many, and not just because of our current circumstances in the world, but because of the nature of our consciousness. Yes, this is the beginning of what we are calling currently otherness. It is this moment that I'm describing, which is really, my attempt to describe it is laughable. So I hope I'll be forgiven by all those watching who know better than I how to speak of this, and all those present in this room who know better than I how to speak of it. That differentiation of self from not self is the beginning of the whole. It's the beginning of suffering. The clinging to self, the objectification of self, the notion of self is a thought form of separation, and will naturally give rise to the thought form of the other, the not self, accompanied perhaps by fear, which very frequently and easily gives rise to hatred. And so I don't think it is saying too much to say that this moment of the original self-perception or claiming of self, that this moment is the beginning of suffering for a sentient being. And I think that this moment is recapitulated for each being who comes into existence. It's not as if there was one moment when it happened to all of humanity or to all bears, or do you know what I mean? It's each of us has this moment. And it's the beginning and the continuing cause of all forms of suffering. And this is why in the prayer that I read over again for you, it immediately at the end comes down to wishing for beings to be free, and it doesn't say human beings, all beings to be free of attachment and aversion. Because with the concept of self and our recognizing that as us, comes attachment to that self and to all that we think is beneficial to that self, or all that self desires or craves or feels it needs, and aversion to that which is perceived as inimical or dangerous to self, or even mildly annoying to self. So that's that right there is the delineation of attachment and aversion. We call it sometimes passion and aggression, or love and hate. And as we talk about love and hate, we're talking in the personality realm, or the realm of the sentient being, not the realm of ultimate consciousness here, or ultimate awareness rather. But if you think for an instant of a circumstance in which you experienced mild aversion, just sort of, oh, well, I don't like peas. That's in the same basket with, I want to kill everybody who looks like X. That's the basket of aversion, hatred. And I love peace is in the basket of grasping, attachment, desire. And there's a third. These are, I'm speaking now of what are called the three poisons. And they are universal in the mind of sentient beings. You didn't invent them. You didn't grow up and develop them. They came very soon after the original equipment arrived. Right? The third of the three poisons is usually called ignorance. Again, that means not knowing. I tend to use the word confusion for the third of the three poisons, because I sometimes think it's the moment that we're most likely to be aware of. We're not as likely to be aware of our own ignorance, but we can be quite aware of our own confusion. It's easier to identify the confusion. But ignorance and confusion for human beings, and I don't know about other forms of animals at the moment, but for human beings, these are panic-inducing states of mind, because they at bottom really are existential threats to the sense of I know who I am, I know what I am, I exist. So confusion about that is considered existential. So these are the three poisons, and they poison everything. They poison everything. We often don't recognize them as poisonous. We think they're, when we are craving something that we think is just wonderful, we think that's good for us. When we're repudiating something that we think is harmful, we think it's inherently bad. We want to push it away. And when we're confused or jealous or just really in a state of not knowing that has anxiety with it, we're quite, I want to say dismembered. I don't know why that word came, but it can feel like that we're caught in a miasma of not understanding, of not feeling mastery, of not feeling control. So once these three have been identified, for myself, and when I first began to study, not just to take teachings, but actually to study with the mirror of my own experience, I began to look at the identification of these three as the vectors. They're called the three poisons in the Buddha Dharma, but you can also think of them as the three vectors for suffering in the world, in existence. And at that point, I began to identify more easily my states of mind or emotion as having a relationship to these three poisons. And it freed me from personalizing things to quite the degree that we normally do. And I'm still in that process of freeing myself in that way. I want to encourage us that this is a process that probably takes lifetimes, but in a given lifetime, much can be accomplished with this. That when you recognize these as vectors of suffering for all sentient beings, you can recognize the innocence of the original error of perception. And this is one of the places that, I've used the word place, it's not a location, it's one of the, I'm going to say places from which the wellspring of compassion can surge forth. When we're no longer personalizing it as, oh, I'm so this or I'm so that, but we recognize that whatever that negative quality that we're identifying is the way it is for beings in samsaric existence, the way it is for sentient beings, easily compassion arises from that simple acknowledgement, that simple perception, freed of even clinging to our own ignorance. Yeah, freed of clinging to our identification with our mean-heartedness, freed of clinging to identification with our own grasping for this or that effect. Yes? Because our condition is, let me just put it this way, widely shared. However bad it may be in your mind at one instant, it's widely shared throughout time and space and throughout the minds of all beings. Widely shared. And at any moment when you're suffering, mental suffering and torment are the worst that I've ever experienced, and I think often it's what we bring to other kinds of suffering, like physical suffering or circumstantial suffering, is what we do with our minds about that. When the mind is freed of grasping to its own suffering as being unique in some way, and therefore, so distinctive. I'm so proud I'm a suffering being. That shows how spiritual I am. I had that mind for a long time. Right? That I suffered from the sufferings of beings showed me that I was really a deeply sensitive human being and of a profound spiritual nature. And then a friend of mine got cancer, and I was working at the time with another friend who was helping me navigate some of these pathways that I'm describing. And I came in weeping because my friend had cancer. And I was filled with grief and fear for her, and da-da-da-da-da-da. I mean, we've all been there. And if not, we will be there. And she just sat there, my friend who was giving me good guidance in that time, she just sat there smiling with, sympathy, concern in her eyes as well. But she knew the friend also, actually. She wasn't crying, and she wasn't gnashing her teeth and wanting to pull her hair out and she said, "And what is it that you're, crying about?" And I said, "She has cancer. She might die. And she'll certainly be suffering because, cancer treatment is sometimes almost worse than the disease." And she said, "So, and are your tears and grief helpful to her?" Well, I started to feel a little anxious at that moment, and I had a feeling I was about to be put on the spot, or was being put on the spot. And I said, "Well, it shows how much I love her." And she just looked at me kind of so patiently and kindly, and said, "Really?" And eventually she said, "Your grief is not helping her. Your love is what will help her." Well, you can tell by the way I described that interaction how powerful an impact it has had on my thinking. It's really an all-permeating understanding now. And so when I talk about not identifying personally with one's own suffering, that's an example, and how she sort of bluntly but gently, booted me out of my little groove there, my little rut that I was in, which, by the way, had been a lifetime of thinking grief and love were the same thing. It went on for years after that, but that was the beginning where that thought form was being dislodged. And now I forget what I was going to say. I usually, with people I haven't been sitting with before, I usually make this known at the beginning. I have a brain injury. That's my excuse. All right? So sometimes I forget what I was going to say, and it's all right. It's fine. It's out there. If I need it, it'll come back, and maybe somebody else will think of it and say it instead of me. That would be fine too. So this perception of the other, which arises from the grasping to self, what I was going to say earlier, sometime before I forgot what I was going to say more recently, was that the the word that is, I think, most powerful to denote what this perception of selfhood or self-existence does to our mind is that it gives us a justification and an explanation for everything that we experience that is that we perceive as foreign to us, in some way negatively different from us, in some way threatening, in some way inexplicable. And when we say in the very profound teaching of the Buddha Dharma that self-grasping, this clinging to self, the notion of self, is the cause of all of our suffering, that's what we have to understand, how that is the case. And we have to become certain of it through our own self-examination and through our observation of life, that all forms of our suffering have their root in a deluded clinging to an imaginary entity called the self. And it's imaginary in the sense that we impute its existence, we impute to its existence a self-existence, meaning an inherent existence. We don't have any recognition of a perception preceding that moment. And that moment of the origin of suffering in the consciousness of an individual infant, let's say, I mean, really, I'm out of here in outer space talking about this. I'm sure there's much error in what I'm saying, but I'm trying to reach something that I think is not just a moment in the history of an individual being, but that moment recapitulates constantly throughout our lives. That we come back again and again and again to that notion of self and some kind of clinging to that as the root of any moment of confusion or suffering or mean-spiritedness or fear that we experience. Even the fear of death, something that we all face, you know. Even the fear of death, our fear of that is not so much that the fear of death for many is said to be associated with the unknown. You know, I don't know what's going to happen, but systems abound for putting parameters of the known into that unknown, so that we think we know. We think we know. And some may indeed know because some return and are able to speak of what they've... Thank you so much. Thanks. Price tag's still on it. You and Meghan Markle. So that fear of what is different from us or other than us, what I was going to say earlier is it's not saying too much to say that that's the root from which springs the strangulating vine of xenophobia or misogyny or racism, or don't like the people on the block, don't like the neighbor. That's the root, that thought of other, which depends upon the thought of self not as a transient moment of awareness or perception, but as a solidly, inherently existing entity. Not necessarily material and solidly existing, because you can have a view of of mind, and you recognize that's not necessarily equated with brain, but you can recognize that there is mind function that is not necessarily embedded in fiber. But in the same way, you can have a view of self that doesn't assume that it's like a brick, but that recognizes that it's an evanescent notion, but we tend to think of it as having an actual inherent, intrinsic existence. Which it doesn't. It's a construct, a notion, an idea. And when it's threatened in any way, or demeaned, or whatever, we run for shelter to other constructs that, that seem to justify our selfness, and so on. And so the self to which we are clinging and grasping, come in. Yeah. And find a seat, and there's one right here. Yeah. So the activity of clinging to that notion is, you could say that the notion itself is the source of all our problems, which we do, but it's the act of clinging to it that we can first identify. And that allows us quite quickly to recognize, in this state of anger, or this state of despair, or this state of fear, or this state of mild annoyance, or whatever, they ask that we not put the chairs on the rugs. So just right there is good. If you want to sit there, as long as you're not blocking somebody else's. If you maybe go back just a titch. Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Does that work for you, Pam? Is that good? Does that work? Okay. So even as we're sitting here, I would like to invite you to kind of curate your awareness and notice in the way that I've been speaking, notice in your responding to it or your reflecting on it, how you may be subtly taking in, pushing away, makes sense, doesn't make sense, don't like, these kinds of activities. They're pretty much a constant stream that we're not always very aware of. This afternoon we'll become more aware of them. We're going to be doing a practice together. But just now, just check in with yourself and see where and how it's registering for you the possibility of actually seeing what it is that I'm talking about, of actually recognizing it in your own experience. So I started by saying nothing is separate. There's no separation. That It is possible to love all beings and all of existence, universally and unconditionally. That the thought of self as an inherently existing entity or phenomenon is false and is at the root of all of our suffering. And the work of the path is to sweep away this confusion. For ourselves, first of all. And to help others eventually do the same. Any reflections that you would like to share? Yes.
Thank you so much for doing this for us. When raising my own children, I remember that moment when that light went off in their head that I'm separate from mom. And you know, if you watch a 1-year-old, you'll see them, they run away from their mother, but if the mother isn't nearby, they run towards them. You know, they won't let you get too far away. And I've often thought about, and I wonder if you might comment, on the psychological effect, and if it were even possible, to help ameliorate that separation. Or is that just the human condition? We have to separate to come back. You know what I mean? I saw all the suffering my own children went through in separation. And all that meant, and trying to find an identity as teenagers. You know, all the things I knew were in trying to establish a self. Maybe, I don't know if it's psychologically impossible or unhealthy in some other way for a person not to do that. But I don't know if you could speak to that.
Not having been a parent in this lifetime, I haven't had that experience, but I have the experience within myself, moment to moment sometimes. I wouldn't presume to say whether it's healthy or wise to try to prevent or ameliorate that. And not just because I wouldn't be qualified to say that, but also because I think I have some sense of what people call the journey of return. Do you know what I mean? That we come into error, and we follow a course that allows error to become swept away or corrected, and we recognize what has been there from the beginning, that we already are what we aspire to become. I don't know that in the human consciousness it's possible to not have that experience of individuation. I think the individuation experience is probably essential to having a healthy, wholesome, and complete interaction with life, actually. So those are my tentative thoughts. I've thought about this a lot, but I don't think I know anything now about it that I used to think I did, but I don't any longer.
I think so too, but I just wanted to know.
Yeah, it's a good question, whether the differentiation is necessary. Mm-hmm. Yes, Elaine. I'm not hearing you.
I'm reflecting on what state I'm in and it's trying to make sense out of things, okay? And you say we came into error.
May I ask you to come forward because I'm not able. I actually have hearing aids in now. You'll be happy to hear, but I couldn't actually hear.
You mentioned about we come in with erroneous perception of who we are. I think that's what I heard you say.
I don't know that we come in with that. I think I think it arises in consciousness at a very primal stage, the perception of self, and therefore with that the perception of other.
Are you saying that there is no separate self at all? Like
there is no separation.
All the people in this room is an illusion?
No, I didn't say that.
Okay, can you kind of address that?
Let's speak of being and existence. In fact, in your handout packet, there's a piece about this. It makes some of this more concrete. Pardon the expression. If there is Gakchen Rinpoche says often, and because we need to hear it over and over again, the mind of a sentient being in a state of seeing reality as it is directly and experiencing the natural arising of the fullness of love and compassion, that the mind of that being is one with, undifferentiated from the mind of every Buddha. And I think I would say that the mind of any sentient being, and again, we're talking about humans, which we have some expertise in. The mind of any sentient being that's caught in anger or fear or confusion is at that moment in the mind of sentient beingness. And that's why I spoke earlier about maybe not over-identifying so much with our personal suffering. Being able to see that as the state of beings who are in a state of not knowing the actual nature of reality and not having, therefore, the full experience of our interconnectedness, our interdependence, and the way our nature of mind is not other than the nature of mind of another sentient being. Nature of mind not being the same as condition of mind. The nature of mind, let's say, is the ultimate nature of mind. We're going to come more to this. I'm not going to try to address all of this in one gulp here, but the condition of our mind is what's happening. It's the coming and going, the movement of mind, what arises, what dissolves, the ever-changing experience that we have of our state of mind. That's condition of mind. It's of relative reality. Here, it's the world we live in. You know, this is the way we experience. If we if we can speak to ultimate reality, the actual nature of reality rather than the experience of reality, the actual nature of reality, in that mind, no coming and going, no arising, dissolving. So the Buddha Dharma definitely speaks to an ultimate nature of mind, and it's with that in that context that I'm speaking of this. So I think I've forgotten your original question, but it might have been responded to.
I'm just trying to clarify if you see this all as illusion, the earth, people.
No, it would be more accurate. One of the wonderful commentators on the 37 Bodhisattva practices says we have a tendency to be a little sloppy in our thinking, and because we don't know how to be precise about these things, so we tend to speak of the nature of reality and then illusory reality, and that this is all illusory. He said much more accurate to say it's not illusory. Here we are. Clearly, tables here, cup, person. So it's not an illusion, but in the way that we perceive it and react to it, we're reacting to it based on illusion about its nature. So I exist, here I am, but not of this nature that it looks like. Right? It's not solid, it's not unchanging, it's not unconditional. It's composite, it's coming and going, it's interdependent with everything else, it's subject to birth and death, so it's not ultimate, it's relative. All of those things speak to relativity, and to conditionality. So we have illusory notions about the nature of reality. We are responding and reacting to the condition of the conditions and circumstances that are visible and palpable and experienced by us, but they aren't indivisible from the nature that we don't know. We feel it, we sense it maybe, but we don't. As long as we're in the state of ignorance, we don't actually, in that instant, fully realize the actual nature of mind, the actual nature of being. So part of the work of meditation and of spiritual practice in the Buddha Dharma is to clear away what obstructs us from actually seeing directly our own nature of mind. And when we actually directly perceive that, we also recognize, as my root lama, Dujam Rinpoche, said, I don't know why we talk about the nature of mind, it's the nature of absolutely everything. So and in the instant of recognition, we know that to be the case. It doesn't mean that recognition is stable. It means we had a glimpse, yes? And then we're back in the soup, where the turnips are bobbing around and we're, so are there other reflections, other thoughts? Yes, what is your name?
Carl.
Carl?
Yeah,
Thank you.
Barbara, I just want to thank you for speaking the truth today. I just wanted to ask you, what are your thoughts on if this reality changed, the reality that we know is being in this physical reality with this physical body?
This physical reality?
Yeah, I call it physical reality. That's the way I describe it because I think of myself as a spirit.
I'm having trouble hearing.
I think of myself as a spirit occupying this body.
Mm-hmm.
That's probably a common definition. So, what are your thoughts on how would things change if our consciousness did not require this physical body?
How would things change if our consciousness what?
Did not require this physical body.
Did not require this physical body?
So, if we get rid of this physical body, how does all this change? Well,
you should maybe take up the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Not the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, but the treasured text of Padmasambhava, which is called the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which describes very graphically and very subtly the experience in the bardo when one doesn't have a body, but consciousness is there. And as long as consciousness has not been completely purified or liberated, still reacting.
Because sometimes I think, I try to imagine all the suffering that we do experience.
Uh-huh.
You know, it's, I think for me, and I think most people, I perceive it as it's attached to this body. It's the survival instincts. It's the survival instincts that we have in the interaction with other physical beings.
Mm-hmm.
And this, we're dealing with scarcity or finite resources that we need to keep the body alive. All the activities, the things that we do, the thoughts that drive those actions to basically stay alive in this world. So I sometimes imagine, well, what would it be like? Not that I'm thinking about, you know, leaving this physical reality prematurely, but how would that change? You know, and how would that change things in all of this?
To not have a body, but that consciousness no longer inhabits a
Still have
body?
consciousness to be able to live, in a sense. I mean, at least you would be consciously aware, but not have to deal with the constraints, you know, in this physical reality.
Well, send us a note. but let me say this, that Garten Rinpoche, my Lama, whom I have great confidence in, at one point I was sitting by his knee, as I love to do, and probably displaying some confusion, which I frequently do, and he said, I think I was complaining about self-grasping, which is what you're talking about, actually. And he cut right through it. He said, Barbara, we will always have some self-grasping as long as we have a physical body. Now remember, self-grasping being the cause of suffering, right? Of everything that you're describing. As long as there's a physical body, we will always have some degree of self-grasping, because that's the reference, the point of reference to which mind returns, which is why in the after-death state, known as the bardo, one of the bardos, it's described as the mind, consciousness being free of the physical body, is still not free of having taken that as a point of reference. So the mind's attachment to the body is the issue, not the body.
Right, but if you go into the bardo, are you going to be consciously aware and suffering from the fact that...
Say again, if you go to, when you're in the bardo, what?
So when you're in the bardo, so you leave this physical reality, you go into the bardo, would you suffer from being consciously aware that you left that physical reality?
I have read that to be the case, but I think that the problem. No, we're talking very conjecturally here, right? And in fact, I asked him something about the bardo at one point, and a question of what happens, and he said, "How would I know, Barbara? I've never been in the bardo," which says something about his mind. Yes, never having needed to go through that transition state. The mental, the mind process, the process of consciousness, is the source of the suffering and the source of the confusion. So any thought that that is cleared just by leaving the body at the time of death, that is an illusion. If consciousness has continuity, it has continuity beyond the moment of death, as what we call the mind stream. Yes, and this is an area where I have a lot of questions myself, but never enough time at the teacher's knee to ask all those questions. So, the mind construction, or the process of consciousness that individual has, or that we as a human race have, it has its own momentum until the roots of those thought forms are liberated, meaning cleansed, dissipated, actually liberated from our consciousness. And they have their roots in karma, yes? So if we're talking about the continuity of the causes of suffering, in the Buddha Dharma we would say that those karmic seeds have not yet come to fruition. And which is why the teachings about karma speak about the importance of the time of death and the moment of death, that you want to be as intentional as possible about how you die, so that you're not in a moment, for example, of anger, precipitated by somebody moving your body in an untoward way, thrown into an anger realm where those seeds continue to proliferate, which they will until they're resolved. So I don't know if this is, I can't say yes, no to your question, but I think what your question points up, for me as I hear you, is something that I think is a danger for us on the path, on the spiritual path. The danger being the thought that we can transcend, that we might be able to transcend our physical existence, and that to be without the body is a greater benefit for us spiritually than to be with it, because there's less distraction, because there's no sense experience, right? I think that's really a fallacy, and a potentially dangerous one, because right here, right now, is the moment when you have every condition and every karmic potential and every potential for aspiration that allows you to take the moment of existence, however long it lasts for you in this lifetime, to take the moment of existence to fully live and to understand the interrelationship of not the interrelationship as if they're two separate, the union of relative and ultimate. Because you are that. That's where the Bodhisattva works. And the Bodhisattva is that, the union of ultimate and relative. There is no phenomenon of appearance that is not also of the nature of the ultimate. So there's no phenomenal reality manifestation that is not also of the nature of the ultimate. And that includes you, right here, right now. So for the Bodhisattva, I say take the whole thing. Body, mind, emotions, circumstances, experiences, memories, dreams, aspirations. Take the whole thing and bring it all onto the path for the benefit of all beings, for the benefit of all. That's what makes the Bodhisattva. The good heart we have, as we talked about right from the beginning, we have the good heart. We are beings who definitely know love and compassion. So the Bodhisattva nature is intact here, but we're not very refined yet, would you agree? Yeah. We have, our questions are so good-hearted, aren't they? Our questions, all the things that we might think to say or ask about, they're really good-hearted. We wouldn't be asking about them if it didn't seem important to us in order for us to be more developed as as practitioners on the path. But don't be attached to your question. Yeah, I'm not saying you are. Don't be attached to the questions that come up. Let them be like little apertures that throw some light into the mind that's questing. Yes?
I have another question. So, when you're practicing meditation and you are extinguishing your thoughts.
You what?
When you're practicing meditation.
You're extinguishing your thoughts?
Yeah, and you get to the point where...
Good luck with that.
Well, let's say you get to the state where you can pretty much extinguish, you're really feeling like you're extinguishing all thoughts, attachments, you're reaching this, this transcendental reality. And is that simulating being in the bardo?
Mm-mm. No, it's taking the instruction to observe your thoughts and materializing it. about which I will have a lot more to say. I would never encourage somebody to try to extinguish a thought. That's just not the way I think it works best for us. I think the practice, we'll be practicing as the days go by, and I'll talk much more about this, but that's one view of what meditation practice means, to quiet your thinking. I'm not a devotee of that form of practice, because the thinking is a natural part of our synaptic adventurousness. Thinking happens, and I think that the practice that I think is very good at the beginning of that, we'll be doing this afternoon, and there I'll talk more about this. So I hope you'll be here this afternoon. Thank you. I really enjoyed that. I think maybe people needing a break. Yeah? T and P? Yeah? So let's come back at 11. So it only gives us 20 minutes, but I think if we all line up promptly. Is this a good moment for you to take a break? Okay, good.
Oh my God, it's Nelson.